morning, everybody. Nice to see y'all. Sorry to be coming to you remotely. I'm here in Los Angeles right now, visiting an aunt who's in town and my family, getting some family time before session. So I always like to start with some kind of group acknowledgement of each other. So if everyone could just unmute on the count of three and just kind of say how you are, just say what's going on outside, say what's going on inside, whatever's coming up for you. Let's just all kind of share a moment together. So 1, 2, 3.
Happy Sunday.
I'm looking forward to
Very nice
all
day here in Los Angeles.
I love it. I love hearing all of our voices of the Sangha. And of course, we have some folks with their camera off, and it's always really nice to be able to see folks when we're talking. So if you're in a comfortable position to turn your camera on so we can all kind of be together, that would be great. I was looking through the Instagram of Ibram X. Kendi, who is the writer of the book that we're currently reading in our study group, our bi-weekly book club study group that we're doing around anti-racism. The book he wrote is called, appropriately, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a great book so far. Anyway, so I'm going through his Instagram and I stumble upon a quote that he highlighted for Angela Davis's birthday, which was January 26th. And the quote from Angela Davis was, in a racist society, it isn't enough to be non-racist. You must be, or we must be, anti-racist. So in a racist society, it isn't enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So that's probably a decades-old quote that's been used and used, but that really is kind of the crux of Kendi's book that we're reading, or at least one of the major points that showed up in this first couple sections that we read. And I'm not going to get too much into it, and we really are having some amazing conversations in this study group. So if anti-racism, studying how race manifests in our life is something that interests you, I highly recommend you come to these every other Thursday meetings. They're quite lively and deep and personal and honest and awesome. But it's just basically this main conceit that, just being not racist is kind of just a first step. And that really to honor the fact that everyone is equal and that everyone deserves equal human experience, we must be anti-racist. We must take steps, invest time and energy to actually combating and creating policy and new ideas that actively combat racism, which is very much alive in ourselves, our institutions, and our policies. So that's the kind of the gist of the book, and I really encourage everyone to join in on every other Thursday. But what it kind of sparked in me, what I wanted to talk about today, just kind of as an experiment, and maybe by the end of this we decide that it's a stupid experiment, but I was kind of wondering what would happen if we take that quote and we replace it, we replace the word race or racism with self, and how that would apply or relate to our practice as Zen Buddhists or meditators of some sort. So if we do that, we get, in a selfist society, it isn't enough to be non-self. We must be anti-self. So I just kind of wanted to break that down and see what we get. So in a selfist society, what does that mean? I think we can maybe all agree, or at least for the sake of this conversation, just kind of acknowledge that modern day America is maybe a particularly selfist kind of society, right? I think we know that the consumerism and the tribalism and the nuclear familyism and the individualism that marks a lot of American culture, I think it's pretty clear that, we are, a lot of our culture, a lot of our society is oriented towards the self and self-preservation, self-promotion. I think that's pretty clear. But I thought of a koan that might point to something a little bit different, maybe a little more whole view. So the koan is case 61 in the Blue Cliff Record, which I have right here, The Secrets of the Blue Cliff Record. It's the third text, the second full book that we use in our curriculum here. And so case 61 says, Fuketsu instructed the assembly and said, if you establish a single particle, the nation flourishes. If you do not establish a single particle, the nation perishes. If you establish a single particle, the nation flourishes. If you do not establish a single particle, the nation perishes. And then it goes on, and there's another part to it that we won't get into right now. But I like this because, and there might be various ways of interpreting this, but for the sake of what we're talking about here, a selfist society, I think what Fuketsu is pointing to, raising a single particle, I think he's getting at raising even the slightest, tiniest idea or concept or attachment or desire, delusion, many different ways to kind of see it. Even the most subtle, basic, simple of ideas, including I am a thing, I am a person, I am an entity in the world. Just that very basic concept of self. You establish just one little idea. And from that, you create an entire world of separation. As soon as I am a thing, separate from you, separate from the birds, separate from Donald Trump, separate from anything, that is how you build a society. That is how you build groups. That's how you build families. That's how you create a world of separation, a world of form. So what I get from this is that you can't have society without establishing self, without making that separation. So to say a selfist society really just means any society, any life, any group, any tribe, any existence at all. You have to establish a particle. You have to establish this sense of self. That's just kind of what we're born into, this sense of self. And all societies, all existence, everything we do, as long as we're trying to survive, as long as we're trying to wake up the next day as a self, we're in a selfist society. We're establishing particles. And the rest of that koan, if you do not establish a single particle, if you totally let go of every concept and idea, totally drop off body and mind so that not a single particle of any idea exists, then the nation perishes. And in the context of this koan, that perishing is almost a good thing, right? The dropping off of self, the letting go of all of my ideas of how things should be and how things are. That's what all the millions and millions of Buddhists around the world are striving for, are working towards, are trying to inspire in others. To let the nation perish, let the self go. So in a selfist society, i.e., any society that you live in, and I will say, maybe there are or have been communities or societies that are like extremely communal, where they really, maybe it isn't a selfist society, maybe it really is acting as one body. I don't know too much about those kinds of societies, but I'm open to that. So maybe not every society is self-oriented, but I think that's what Fuketsu's pointing to. So in a selfish society, in the world in which I live, it's not enough to be non-self or no self. To be no self. What is that, right? That sounds, for a lot of us, that sounds kind of odd or esoteric or counterintuitive, right? I'm Bobby. This is me. Look, I'm touching me. And I can see all of you. I wake up with this self every day. So what could this be? What could this mean to be no self? And for those of us on the practice path, it's tempting to think that this no self is something to become, something to achieve, some kind of thing to like work towards and gain. But as we know from the Buddha himself and from all the various teachers and ancestors since, they say very clearly that no self is just simply what you are already, inherently, right? That's what the Buddha woke up to, was that all beings inherently are the Tathagata, are no self. That's just the baseline fact, the absolute truth of our life, is that this concept of self is just a delusion, all the way down to the most basic particle of self. And so to be no self, essentially you don't have to do a damn thing. You already are. We already are. That's just the nature of our life, is totally empty, without self. It's kind of like Dogen says in the Fukan Zazengi that we chant in the evenings during Ango. He says, "Indeed, the whole body is free from dust. Who could believe in a means to wipe it clean?" That's just what we are. There is no particle. There is no dust. So why even talk about meditation? Why even talk about any kind of method to achieve or get or somehow create this no self? That's already wrong. There's no dust to sweep. And yet we don't see it. It's very difficult. Right, the Buddha said we are inherently no self, but we don't see it because of upside down thinking, because we are stuck in this world of forms and this world of self. And so, at least for those of us doing Zen, for those of us who care about our meditation practice, we go to great lengths and put in a lot of effort to try to illuminate this fact of no self, right? It's not a thing to achieve or gain. It's a thing to reveal, a thing to uncover, to dust off. So we, and I think because it's inherently what we are, I truly think that each and every one of us, not only us holy spiritual people here at Sweetwater, but everybody, I think, comes up against this fact and has this experience, this firsthand experience of no self. I talk to a lot of people who, meditate for 20 minutes and they have this incredible experience of everything dropping off. I talk to people who, go jogging, and at a certain point in their jogging, they get totally lost in their jogging and they have that little tiny glimpse of no self. Or maybe you're working on a project and you just get so consumed and so immersed and one with your work that you literally illuminate that no self within your work. It can happen in all kinds of ways. But in Zen, we really try to cultivate an intimacy with that being no self, getting deeper and deeper, familiar and intimate with that firsthand experience of the self, the body and mind dropping away. right? So this sounds like a totally esoteric, difficult, mysterious kind of practice that so many of us dedicate our lives to. And yet, this quote says it's not enough. It's not enough to have this experience of no self. We must be anti-self if we take it further. And I'll get to that in a minute, but it just reminds me of every morning we chant the identity of relative and absolute, the Sandokai. And in there it says, to encounter the absolute being this no self, dropping off of body and mind, total emptiness. To encounter that, to have that experience, is not yet enlightenment. That's what the sutra says. To encounter the absolute is not yet enlightenment. Just like this Angela Davis quote that we're appropriating, it's not enough to be no self. We must be anti-self. And that's kind of a harsh phrase. I want to be very clear that by anti-self, it really doesn't mean self-loathing. It doesn't mean shame. It doesn't mean self-resentment. It doesn't mean rejection of the self. It's not that self is bad. I know it kind of sounds like that, anti-self. But I think it would be very unfortunate if that was the takeaway from this talk today. So I want to be very clear. I don't mean that. In fact, studying and embracing the self really is the ticket to developing that intimacy with no self, as contradictory as that may sound on the surface. But no, I think anti-self in this case, I think pretty much just points to the Bodhisattva vow, which you may recognize from a lot of our talks and a lot of readings in Buddhist texts, the Bodhisattva vow, which essentially is kind of saying, the Bodhisattva vow is kind of what Angela Davis is saying here. It's not enough to dwell or experience the absolute, to experience no self. The Bodhisattva vow says, from that experience of no self, I will conscientiously vow to bear witness and engage in the world of forms, the world of diversity, and the world of delusion, right? Because we have that experience that me as a self, all the things, all the 10,000 dharmas, all the various forms, they're all empty. They're all delusion. But this Bodhisattva vow is making an effort to live within that world of delusion, to acknowledge self, to acknowledge others, to acknowledge the suffering of the world, to make that separation between ourselves and others for the sake of being of service, to alleviate suffering, right? Because from the absolute standpoint, from that place of no self, total emptiness, suffering is emptiness. There's no such thing. To even talk about suffering versus non-suffering or delusion versus enlightenment, that's already delusion. You're already making separation. So the Bodhisattva vow says, but I will engage and just hold on a little bit to that delusion, to that world of separation and forms, so that we can collectively wake up together and collectively heal together and assuage suffering. And of course, the famous, beautiful koan around that is case 38 in the Mumonkan, the Gateless Gate, where Goso said, it's kind of like a buffalo passing through a lattice window. Its head, horns, and all four legs pass through. Why is it that the tail cannot? So just quickly, if I imagine that this buffalo is me and passing through the lattice is having this great awakening to no self, and I really am able to push all through all of my delusion and all of my conditioning in my head and my horns and my legs and get all the way through to see the emptiness of everything, that tail still wraps and latches onto that lattice and holds on to a little bit of delusion, agrees and vows to live within this world of delusion, this world of self for the sake of others. And I think it maps onto the actual Angela Davis quote too, because to be non-racist is to acknowledge the fact that race is a myth, a created myth, and that we're all equal, and that we're all just humans. But to stop there doesn't do anything to combat how racism still exists in our life. And so we then become anti-racist, where we acknowledge and engage in a world of race. We acknowledge the differences. We acknowledge this myth of race as something that does exist and that we have to engage with and study and understand and unravel and collectively encourage others to wake up to this reality of race, the relative reality of race, the relative reality of separation, of form, of self. We have to engage in that way. And so our practice as bodhisattvas is, how do I do that in my life? How is my life set up? How is myself set up with my karma to be actively anti-selfist? For some of us, that's just being a good employee, being an encouraging, supportive coworker at work, being a good mother, being a loving parent. For some of us, that's founding and establishing a Zen temple and spreading the Dharma in that way. Everyone has their own path, and being intimate with what my life can do with my ingredients to be anti-self. That's what our practice is. And I think this is a particularly relevant idea because we're going into this session right now, right? So we're ending, we split up the 90 days into two, right? So we're just finishing up the second 45 days. And that takes great effort to commit to this practice. And not just myself and Kosei, who have been following the whole schedule, but all of you who have really stepped up. And I mean, we have consistently 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 people coming to programs. It's really amazing to feel the power of how we've all really dived in together. And then we have this session. This is a 7-day full-on week session that is not a pleasant practice. I know we talk a lot about, it's tempting, and it's true that our practice, meditation, zazen, is for myself, right? My own awakening, my own well-being, my own sense of harmony. That's for sure. That happens. That's part of our practice. But to see sesshin and to see intensive practice, to see devoted commitment to our practice, I kind of like the idea of seeing it as an anti-selfist behavior. Really making an effort, investing time and energy into cultivating no self, into supporting others in their path to no self. It might be hard for some of us to think, like, how is sitting in silence, not doing anything, an act of service to the world? And that's a really great koan. And the only thing I can say is try it and see, because I can just speak from my own experience, having done hundreds of sessions, that I really do think that the efforts and the effects of that kind of intensive practice do ripple out. And the things that happen to me or you as you sit in this intensive way ripples out. It changes how you treat others. It changes how you approach your work. That's kind of on the literal side, but even just the mysterious side of how that ripples out. How you coming to session and supporting Kosei or supporting Seisen in their practice, that's a service. And every time we sit session, whether there's 2 of us or whether there's 20 of us, I really do think that it's an anti-selfist, an anti-delusion behavior that really does serve all beings. And so, as we're about to dive into this intense week together, I don't know, maybe that'll serve as some kind of motivation and support that we're all coming together to not only dive into our practice for ourselves, but to really act as one in service to the whole world through our efforts, our anti-selfist efforts. So thank you all for your practice. Thank you for listening. And looking forward to sitting with those of you who signed up this week very much.